when I was in seminary. But I can write in Hebrew. I can make it look like I know what I'm doing. I'll put the words and letters up here in right order. And I'll try to give you a sense of what they mean. This is a B, this is an R, this is a Y, this is a T. Goes backwards, of course, right to left. So it's pronounced berit, beriat, something like that. Hebrew doesn't have any vowels, so you can make it whatever you want. Doesn't have vowels. Hebrew doesn't have it. Not there. So berit or something like that, what it has to do basically means being tied to. Okay? So you're tied, like a rope, tied together. You're bound, like literally bound together. Greek, the root of that is duo. Looks like this. Duo also means to be tied, bound. It's a root of several things. We use duo for devotion. You give devotion to a saint. You doulos for them. Or actually it's doulios for them. You offer them devotion. You are bound to that saint in admiration and devotion to those sorts of things. It's also the root they use for slavery. Okay, it's used because you're bound by a chain to a master in some sense, right? Slavery, by the way, was kind of the old school way of doing credit cards. People say we don't have slavery today. You're full of nonsense. We have slavery. We just call it credit. Okay, that's what it was in the Old Testament days. People look back and say, "Oh, it's so bad." People put themselves in slavery. If you owed a debt, they didn't have a contract. They didn't believe you're going to pay those 15 chariot loans. Make your payments. They bound you in slavery. You worked first, then you got whatever you wanted. You worked it off. You did the work, and then you got it. We see that in the Old Testament, don't we? Jacob wants a wife. That's the one. She's the one I've been looking for. Met her at the well. You worked for me for 7 years. You can have her. Right? He worked for 7 years. Goes to have her. Get to the point where they're ready to give him to her. He wakes up the next morning. That ain't her. Got this one. She's the big sister. You're supposed to give her instead, right?
Yeah. Labor gave the older.
Right? 7 more years, right? Still there. We still have these things. Okay, so being tied down. Another word we have here for this, you're going to like this one, it has right to do with slavery, marriage. Bound right together in marriage. You're tied to someone else. You are bound to that person. Same word. Marriage, slavery, bond, tied down. All those things all together. This pervades other languages. We have this in Spanish. Anyone here speak Spanish? Any Spanish speakers? No? You might know this word anyways. What's the word in Spanish for wife?
Esposa.
See, we have a Spanish scholar.
Oh, yeah. That's it. See.
All right? Esposa. Esposa means wife, okay? What's plural of esposa mean? Esposas. You know? Might be wives, right? Yeah. Handcuffs. Handcuffs. Spanish lesson for the day. You can take it home. You can keep that one. Okay, so
we're going to get involved in sex. Yeah.
So this really does come down to the thing. This barit, the duo, whether you're Greek or Hebrew. We're talking about Old Testament covenants right now, so that's what we're going to have to deal with. Stick with the Hebrew, I guess, for that. But really, this is the deal. Binding in a relationship. I would put this with this. I think that's a pretty good way to sort of do it. It's a binding of relations. We're bound together in a promise to belong to one another. Like you have in a marriage. Do you? Yes. Do you? Yes. Kids are keeper. Pay the rent. You're bound together in a special way. That you're kept and you're sort of bound together for life. And that's another thing I think with modern society that we see a lot of problems with is even covenants we look at is like, oh, but it's just like a promise. You promise to love, honor, and cherish and obey. Oh, yes, you know how to do. She's the sweetest thing I ever met. 5 years later, 10 years later, 30 years later.
2 months later.
I did last year. I'm blessed in my parish. I have a number of very long, very successful marriages, and I had the opportunity lately to bless not one but multiple 50-year anniversaries. We had one couple that did 50 last year, and the year before we had another 50 anniversary. They said, but at church on Sunday we want to renew our vows in the church. So I had to do it right in front of the church on Sunday morning. They came up, and I looked up in the book. You don't do that very often. Where's the book? I had to go to the book. I just looked for the book. Oh, here we go. Do you promise to keep the vows you made when you were first married? That's pretty much it. That's all that's in the book. That's pretty lame, isn't it? Kind of a real short ceremony is what it looked at me. And so I said, I got to stretch this thing out a little bit. I said, because by the way, I promised this 50 years ago. You know, you guys remember what you had for breakfast last Thursday? What you promised 50 years ago? I mean, come on. So I said, do you promise to keep the promise, or do you promise to keep the company you made 50 years ago, which, by the way, was this? And I read it to them and said, and then they said, okay, that sounds pretty good. Yes, I'll do that. You know, binding together in a certain familiar relationship is really the heart of it. And the reason I say this has such an important thing to do with our faith and our relationships with each other, as you see, I talk about how our church faith is sort of, we're bound together in community. That's true, but we're also not bound to each other just because of, you know, if you'll raise the chickens, I'll provide the goats and I'll cut the wood and I'll do, you know, we're not Amish, are we? You know, all those people get along pretty good, you know, lots of chickens around. But you start to have these other issues that come up with, you know, we're bound together not by common need, really anymore. You know, we all go to grocery stores now, right? You know, if there's a, you know, I don't know, a drought of bananas or whatever, they just raise the price. They don't go away. They just cost more. You know, there's a drought in the north right now of corn. So gasoline's costing more. Cereal's going to cost more this next year. Ethanol, all that stuff. Whiskey. Costs more. Not Wisconsin, mind you. They have a grand there to drink. But all these things, we are bound together by this covenant relationship we have with God. And that was the whole point, right? God said, if you will do this, you'll be my people. I think part of the thing the kind of Jewish community's lost, they've lost it. You know, the Jews say they're God's, you know, chosen people, right? Chosen to do what?
Win the world.
Yeah, they forget that. That's what their job was. You know, we're just chosen. God chose us. We're great. We're good. See you all later. Have a good time. Are you chosen? No, you're not chosen. You're not one of us. You know, and that's kind of what Paul's getting at, right? He goes, God can raise up from the stones, from the ground, from the dirt, children to become Abraham. It's not about whose bloodline you're in. You were chosen to be a kingdom of priests, to gather all nations, to draw them all back into the love of God, to be part of that covenant relationship. You know, when God makes these covenants with us, He keeps these things, and He always keeps His promises, right? You have these covenants that are bound together, and these, you know, there's always a sign or a symbol, something as a reminder that you've kept these things. Now, some of these covenants, I'll pull this together. You guys are so far back here. See what? That wasn't as big. It wouldn't work out well. Covenants were common in kind of old school days. You know, these people had seen this. The old ancient Near East sort of cultures had a lot of covenants that were bound, kind of like what you guys approached. You know, legal contracts. You're bound together in promises. Kingdoms would bind you to other things. Slavery was a common thing. If you couldn't afford things, you were bound together. You had to serve someone for a number of years to get whatever you wanted first. But God's a little different. God's covenants are very charitable, and sometimes usually it follows kind of an act of where we need to be shaped that up. You know, covenants usually come around whenever you need a reminder of what it is you were made for. You're made for this, you're made for that. You're made in the image of God to be holy. It's your Father's will. You know, even the law comes after a time of, you know, we've kind of gone in a different direction for a while. It's time to get back together. When we start looking at our church relationships, you know, our family relationships, I think a lot of times people have lost the sense that in church, it does matter that you all come and be a part of your regular worship. One of the signs of the covenant that we have with God is we honor the Sabbath. And Sabbath is really a large part of keeping the covenant with God. When you're bound to God, man, you really can't get around that. This is a sad statistic we learned from Father Culpepper a couple weeks ago. He says, I'll ask you guys this question. What do you think the number is? If you are a devoted church member, how often are you in church? How many Sundays out of 4 or 5 per month? How many Sundays are you in church? A devoted member. Every Sunday, pretty much.
All of them.
Unless you're sick, maybe you have a weekday thing, you know. He said the average regular attendance of a faithful parishioner is 1.7 Sundays. 1.7. You can kind of imagine that, you know. I have some parishioners who come every other week. Maybe you have one of these too. Maybe you are one of these, and if you are, I'm sorry. I'm talking about what I'm talking about.
On that song.
I have some folks, and I don't know, when I grew up, I had people like this too, who kind of come every other week. You know, maybe they live out in the country, or you know, they have a long way to drive, or whatever. You come every other week, except that one time when you're supposed to go and the stock show was in town. except that one time, but you had a soccer game to go to, or Cowboys are playing at noon. That one, when you get the grumbling, you always tell you to hit his hot spot. And all of a sudden, if you missed one of those things, it only takes one or two of those missing those to make you, if you're in every other week, all of a sudden you're 1.7. See what I'm saying? We're really bound together in this covenant with God in the sense of our relationship has promises. It's not just we're chosen to be God's people, God likes you, and you're chosen, God likes you, but you also have certain responsibilities in these things. Every time we baptize children, because I don't think his study's going to go this far into the New Testament stuff, because I think you're sticking pretty much with the...
We get to the new covenant with Father Crary.
So, the prophets' times where you're going...
Yeah.
Okay, so beyond that, of course, we have, whenever we're going to be doing this probably in Easter, usually every time you baptize a child, you have the baptismal covenant. Well, what's that? How's that thing begin? Starts off with, you ask the people being baptized, right? First off, do you want to be baptized? I always ask it. It's right in there. Do you want to be baptized? Do you promise to? They're not old enough. The parents say, do you promise to see that this child is brought up in a Christian life and faith? I have families who come to me, and I've upset several folks over this. I'm not ashamed to say that I did. I've upset several folks because they called me up and said, we need to get our kid done. I heard it another way once. Someone was back and said, I need to get my boy dipped. Get my boy dipped? I'm not sure I know what you're talking about. And he said, we want to schedule the baptism. I haven't seen him, never seen him, never heard of him. Oh, well, we grew up there. We've been members of that church since 1975. We've been here forever. Well, I've been here 5 years. I've never heard of you. And I'm pretty much sure I've been here just about every Sunday, We have kind of a tiny church. It's probably like St. Paul's. You can't really sneak in and not be noticed, So they said, well, we grew up here, but we're part of the family. We belong to that church. But I said, look, one of the first things you promise in the baptismal covenant for your children, will you see that this child is brought up in a Christian life and faith, which includes regular Sundays, worship, and sometimes in between, like you all said. There's certain major feast days, there's other opportunities where, why would you not want to come get God's grace? You have these opportunities to come and do this, and if you're gonna bring a child here, and I know for a fact you're not doing this for yourself, why would I think you're going to do it after you get your kid done? Or we did your boy, you know what I mean? It's not really going to work out too well that way. So you're starting to get what I'm saying. It's really important that we are bound not only by saying, I belong here, but I generally am bound to this. I am tied to you. Having this relationship is so, so important. Relationships have everything to do with how healthy a church is. You can have all the right... Listen, you can have $1 million budget. You can have incense coming out of every air conditioning bin. I think I'd admit that, don't you? Save us the time of having to do all this business. Just throw it right in the air handler, let it pump it out evenly over the whole building. I'm all in favor of it. And it's more than, you can have the nicest liturgy, you can have the nicest building, you can have the nicest youth ministry, you can have arcade games lining the walls of your youth room, All the kids love coming to church here. It's all great. They come and play and they hang out and they do their studying here. There's churches that do that. There used to be a Methodist church in Irving that had you came to study at the church. You came to study. You got points on a little swipe card, like a GameWorks. You ever been to GameWorks? Maybe too modern a reference for this crap. Yeah. Well, back in the days, you just put the nickel in the machine and it went down there. Yes. And you either spun the little thing out and shot the asteroids, or that might be still a little too modern for some folks. I'm not quite sure. Pac-Man. There's some churches that do that. They try to get the kids to come by saying, if you do your homework, if you come to youth group, you get credits on a card, then you come over here and hang out. You can have all of that. You have a great budget. Doesn't mean you're really living that covenant relationship with God. You can have a church packed, but you can have a little chapel full of 10, 12 people praying devoutly, and have a much better community than sometimes you'll have in a major, huge place. So don't be ashamed by size. Size is no indication of the health of the place. Relationships are a huge sign. The health of the congregation is a huge sign of their covenant relationship, not only with God, but their bounding to each other. Before I get off this, I want to just mention a thing I just thought of is a poem you guys may be familiar with. That thing that John Donne wrote about who the bell tolls? You ever heard that? may have heard it, ask not for whom the bell rings, it rings for you, it rings for thee. What's that about? I heard those words. What's that poem about?
Yeah.
About a funeral, right? Church bells are ringing. At a funeral, you ring the bells for a church. In fact, in the Shoda House, and still in my church, we do this. When someone dies, we ring the bell one time for every year they were alive. And so as you're going out to the columbarium or as you're going to whatever else, ringing the bell. So people in the community, it's a small town, small neighborhood, hear the bell. And church bells ringing like crazy. It's something different. It's not just the normal bell. It's not the carillon. I know you guys have a carillon. It's kind of fun. It's not 2. It's not 3. It's not on the hour. You know what I mean? The bell's ringing and it's ringing and it's ringing and it's ringing. Why is it ringing? And basically they say, who does the bell ring for? Because you know that if it's ringing, that means there must be a funeral. It means who died, right? You know that something's gone wrong. Someone's died. I didn't hear about it. Who does the bell toll for? And the poet says, don't ask who it rings for. It's ringing for you. Because when one of us dies, it affects all of us. Right? That's a real binding. That's when you're really tied together. You get a real sense that there's a covenant here that's beyond just, I'm on the altar guild this week, so I'll see you at Saturday at 10 o'clock. It's beyond that. It's not just, here's your pledge card for the year, hope you turn it in. If not, we hope you'll do something with it, other than use it as a bookmark in your prayer book or something like that. It's being bound and knowing that you do have things you're bound to. I think this is so important because, you constantly hear things. Some of you may be like this, or some of you may know people who are like this, and it's sort of easy for me to come in here as a visitor and rant about it and let you all have to deal with the aftermath of it. That's the benefit of being a visiting clergy. You get to come in and drop the bomb and say, now you clean that up. When you're bound to somebody else and you have responsibilities, you don't have any responsibility. Because it's sort of an autonomous thing. I'm not bound to do anything for these folks. I'm not bound, I'm not tied to them. I can come or not come, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't affect anybody. And it absolutely does. Our worship, our prayers can be bound together, tied together, be lifted to God. And knowing that we have a community where we look after one another is huge to what it is to being one of God's people. And as you go through this, you're going to see more and more, whenever you get to the other covenants with these other priests who speak to you about this stuff, you're going to see a lot more that has to do with being bound to folks and being bound to a law, being bound to a rule. But this is the thing I was going to say, this is the thing I'll drop for you. Every now and again I start talking about things like, let's see, what are the hot ones? What are the things that get everybody uncomfortable? Tithing is one. Talk about tithing. Turning right out. Turning down, talk about something else, Father. Oh, yeah. He did a great job, didn't he? Wasn't that a great presentation? Here's another one. Confession. Oh, Father, we're not Roman Catholics. You ever hear that? You say it? You said it? I should be made to say it even. I'm not going to make you say it out loud. That'd be a public confession here. That's the way it was in the old days. You made public confession in front of the whole group. Do it now. Yeah, they did. John Calvin was in favor of doing that. John Calvin said, let's go back to the patristic days where we had to confess it in front of the church. We don't talk about it for a minute. It used to be you had to go sit in front of you made a confession, you had to do it in front of the whole church. You had a 4-stage process to be restored back in the community. That was accountability, big time. First step, you were a weeper. You had to sit outside the church and cry.